You ready? Sure. Morning.
Morning.
Everybody. It's a nice full Zendo on this December wintry day. Thank you for making the trip. Thank those of you who are here for Rahatsu who've made the trip from Europe. Can I just see your hands if you've come in for the session this week? Great, welcome.
Great.
Welcome, thank you. Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Musho Sensei, or Diane Hamilton, and and this is my husband Michael. Want to introduce yourself?
Michael Zimmerman, Mugaku Sensei. Sensei means teacher in Japanese, for those that don't happen to be Japanese.
Okay, good. So we're teaching together. Actually, it's the first time we've given a talk together in this way, so bear with us because, you know, some things require a partner and some things are challenging when you have a partner, so we're gonna kind of work this out. We could use your support. So
there are a lot of things that are challenging with a partner.
Yeah, that's right. So yesterday we gave a workshop here, and we thought it would be a really kind of interesting endeavor, if you will. Michael used to be the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, and I worked in the justice system as the Director of Mediation for a number of years, which is how we met. And we thought it would be really important and interesting maybe to just take a look into this particular time in history and what it is the East and the West are offering each other in the way of a kind of wholeness of experiencing reality. In the sense that the East, I read a quote by the Buddha this morning, and the Buddha said a very important thing. He said, "I teach one thing and one thing only, and that is the alleviation of suffering." And what the Buddha's insight was, and what the tendency of looking into the human experience from the Eastern perspective, is that solving the great matter of life and death, or solving the problem of your kind of chronic not okayness with the way things are, or a sense of yearning or a sense of longing for something that you don't quite have, that the Buddha's insight was really that the only way to do that is to look at the nature of your own mind. And that to look to the exterior to solve those issues for us is really the wrong view. That basically looking to our external circumstances, looking to others, looking to the government, looking to our partner. I mean, on a certain level, of course, we're going to do that, but there's a deep way, unless we make peace with our own mind, that there's something simply unsolvable when we look that direction. Now, the West, hi, Wynn. The West, of course, has a very profound relationship to the exterior. And in fact, has, in a certain way, a critique of the East might be that whatever its wisdom in terms of the alleviation of suffering, it kind of seems to have fallen short in the way of social justice. You know, in India we still have the caste system, right? The gender balance, gender rights still don't really occur in the East. It's rough on women now to be Japanese.
Yeah, democracy is not an Eastern invention.
It's not. And the Enlightenment, with all of its principles of rationality and fairness and equality and even that of science, didn't occur in Asia. It occurred in Europe and in the States. And so we kind of want to look at what is that exactly? What is that difference, and how do we understand these two impulses, and what effect does that have on our lives? Does that make sense to you all, what we're interested in? So from that, just kind of little setup, I'm going to turn over to Mike. Go ahead.
Okay. As Diane said, the East interior, the West exterior. And a friend of ours uses a nice example. He says, Moses and the Israelites experience oppression in Egypt. What do? They leave Egypt, they go across the Sinai, they go to Palestine, slaughter all the inhabitants, live there, and try to live a life in a community that externally will improve their way. Improve their life. And in the West, we are heirs to that, to the Greek rationalists. When we have a problem, we externalize it. We tend to see individuals as autonomous. You know, we focus on individuality. That's what the Enlightenment's all about. We do things externally. And we look for a solution to our unsatisfactoriness outside. I'm a lawyer.
With mixed results.
Mixed results. And as Diane said, in the East, you could argue there's mixed results about social justice, about governing systems, because when that unsatisfactoriness, you look inside as opposed to outside. Whereas, is there truth there? Is one right, one wrong? They're probably both right, they're both wrong, everything's and. So, my experience as a judge and a lawyer, the program we taught yesterday was justice and compassion, trying to highlight those two things. Well, I want to talk a little about justice because that's sort of what, as a lawyer and as a judge, I was a law professor for a while, is sort of a theme of what I've done with my life. And it's also what we in a democratic society place a high premium on. Justice. What is it that we talk about when we talk about justice? So I'd like to just address very briefly my experience with justice and my idea of justice. And then Diane is going to talk to you about some other voices. But when I started out, when I was young, I never knew any lawyers. I didn't know anything about the legal system, but I was always interested in politics and government and philosophy. And what was, how did that reflect on what was just for humans, what was appropriate for humans? So I was very much thinking in terms of Enlightenment ideas. How does the individual relate to the state? How do individuals relate to each other? How do we govern ourselves? How do we treat each other fairly? And I was looking for fairness, if you will. I was looking for the justice system, for the political system to produce an end to suffering, if you will.
And principles of enlightenment, of the Enlightenment that are actually collective principles, laws, ways in which we understand ourselves from a kind of objective perspective, if you will.
Sure. So in politics and in law, we're always looking for a better principle, a better way to organize ourselves so we can all feel that it's fairer. And that's really important to us in the West. As a young lawyer, I had the opportunity to clerk for a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and I went back there thinking this is the paradigm of what justice is going to be. So Diane likes these couple of examples I use. So when I was in law school, I studied antitrust, and I don't know if you know about antitrust, but basically it's about economic democratic principles, which is we don't allow people to aggregate too much power, economic power. The law breaks up economic power that fixes prices, things like that. So I had studied that, and I was quite an enthusiast, and I got to the Supreme Court, and there was a case that the court was deciding about two railroads that run across the northern tier of states in the United States, about 2,000, 2,500 miles, about 100 miles apart. And they serve all the wheat farmers up in that area. And the one railroad was owned by a huge conglomerate, and the other was by itself. And you just looked at a map of these and you said, if the big one gets to acquire the little one, that sure as hell looks like a monopoly. It looks like an opportunity to exploit prices and all of that. So by antitrust theory, you shouldn't permit that. So I argued to my judge, I was, ripe old 25, and I'm telling the judge, who's in his 60s, that, this is really wrong. This really shouldn't be permitted. And he came back from the conference with the other justices, and they voted 9-0 to permit it. I was stunned.
Against Mike's
opinion.
opinion.
Like anybody gave a damn what I thought. But the interesting part is I said to my judge, I said, well, I sort of made my little speech,
Now keep in mind, he's making this speech to the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He's 25.
I'm 25 from Utah, I basically had been a hot rodder, before I went to law school, so I have immense sophistication at this sort of stuff. So I said this to him, and he said to me, he said, I have a brother who used to be a brakeman on the Great Northern, which is one of these two railroads. You know what a brakeman does, make sure the couplings are working on the cars and that sort of stuff. And he told me one day, he said, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to have these two railroads only 100 miles apart going across this northern tier of states. That's all he said. So what was I left with? I was left with, wait a minute, what happened to these great ideas that are supposed to allocate, you know, resources and decide what's fair among people? I heard a story about a guy's brother who was a brakeman. So the others, so, you know, the law wasn't, justice wasn't quite what I thought it was, maybe. And the other story is about pornography cases. In those days, the standard for what was obscene was it has to appeal to your prurient interest in sex, whatever that is, which we all have.
Let's vote. How many of you have prurient interest?
We all have prurient interest in sex. And
yeah, is there any other interest?
And was it without redeeming social value, taken as a whole? So you applied this to books and movies and things like that. And one of the justices had articulated the standard. He said, you know, other people were trying to put words on it, and he just basically said, I know it when I see it. He put that in an opinion, which seems kind of silly, but maybe it's not. Because the articulation...
Except we should notice that it does require you to watch.
It does require to watch it, that's right.
Just
so
a
what
little,
would happen is
little detail.
Yeah, these cases would come up, and of course, some of the judges would just call for the pornography, you know, so they could decide whether it was when they saw it. So, you know, this didn't seem too scientific to me, but I guess I figured there was something they were getting out of it that I wasn't. But one of the things...
Or hadn't yet.
Or was hoping for it.
Yeah.
But one of the ways that, sort of a startling example of watching this was on movies. What they would do is there would be a little room in the bottom of the Supreme Court, and they would set up a projector, and some old guy from the clerk's office would come down and he'd put a reel of, you know, the movie on. And these movies, of course, you know, were always an hour and a half or something like that. And the law clerks would like to go, of course. And they were all males when I was there. And a few of the justices would go, well, 4 or 5 of them would go. A couple of them said there's never anything that's obscene, so they didn't need to watch it. And the others thought anything anybody else said was obscene, so that's fine. They didn't need to look at it.
Huh.
So we'd go into the basement and watch these movies. And what I learned, well, the image that's great is there was a justice who was actually a great justice, but he was almost blind. And he was a Wall Street lawyer, and he wore pinstripe suits, and he was bald, you know, frizzled hair. He had to sit about 4 feet from the screen. So when the clerk is projecting the movie, part of what you're watching is on the back of this guy's Brooks Brothers suit, okay? And he's going like this, and we're looking at his back. But the interesting thing I learned about making pornographic movies was that these judges only watched 10 or 15 minutes, because most of these weren't very good anyway. Well, what it really told me was, if you want to put the socially redeeming part, you know, the guy who comes out with a clipboard and the white coat and says, this is a movie about nymphomania and its ills and perils, you put that in the first scene. Because if you put the socially redeeming part later, nobody watches it. So the movies that had the sex scene right at the front end were pornographic. The ones that had the guy with the clipboard weren't. So I walked away from this. What did this tell me? This sort of told me that what was justice? I mean, what was this set of rules that was going to answer these problems? And it was pretty clearly, I mean, I was kind of disillusioned. Well, in fact, I was probably just naive. And then when
idealistic.
Idealistic.